Welcome to Fight Back Radio, a production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggles. I'm your host, Richard Berg, and I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in again to Fight Back Radio. Our next episode after this one's we're gonna cross the 6-month mark, and I think we're doing pretty good. Our sound quality has gotten much better. Our technicians have always been good, but I've learned how to turn the knobs right and not do things that mess it up in a big way. And so we're getting better with that. We've had just a fabulous set of guests over the last 6 months. The people that have agreed to come on to Fight Back Radio and really go to the heart of the people's struggle and to talk from that perspective has been amazing to me. And so if you're new to Fight Back Radio, I really want to encourage you to go back and look at past episodes and go listen to Carlos Montes or Frank Chapman or Kobe Guillory or whatever. There are more and more. I mean, it's just we've really had a good group of guests on this. And today is no exception. We have a fabulous guest. My old friend Joe Burns is on our podcast today. And Joe just published his third book from Haymarket Books. It's called Struggle Unionism. And those of you who have been critical of me of not talking more about theory may like this episode. Joe breaks down in a very working class way, a very understandable way, some of the theories about the labor movement and where we stand with things and how economics work and why workers have to be part of any kind of progressive movement or struggle or anything serious about social change. And I think you'll enjoy this. I think you'll enjoy Joe Burns. He's the director of bargaining for the Flight Attendants Union. He's been in the labor movement for a long time. As I mentioned, he's an old friend. I know him back from the 1980s and 90s in the days when he was working in healthcare. So please enjoy our interview with Joe Burns. Welcome, Joe, to Fight Back Radio.
Hey, thanks, Rich, for having me on.
Oh, it's great to have you. Usually I start with, often I start with a little bit of an introduction, and I'm thinking with you, Joe, I've known you a long time. I remember I was a housekeeper at the University of Chicago Medical Center, and you were a transporter at the University of Minnesota, I think president of an AFSCME local when I met you. What was that like, and can you take us from that to what you're doing now so people know who you are a little bit?
Yeah, so late 80s and into the 90s, I was a healthcare worker, and I was president of my local up in Minnesota at the University of Minnesota Hospital. And when I was there, I did like a lot of strike support work, a lot of, work both in my local, but also broader within the labor movement and sort of the fight backs that were going on at the time supporting workers. Subsequently went to law school, and then following law school, worked on, it was here in Chicago, worked with the Illinois nurses. And for the past 20 years, I've been working with the Association of Flight Attendants, and a variety of capacities, but mainly doing bargaining. And most recently, I'm currently the director of collective bargaining and the general counsel at the Flight Attendant Union.
Okay, so you have a wide breadth of experience in the labor movement, and you wrote a book called Struggle Unionism, which we're going to talk about here today, and we'll put it in our show notes. But it's one I highly recommend to our listeners that they check out. But let's get into it a little bit. So I want to start. Some of the Fight Back Radio listeners accuse me of not being theoretical enough. So this will take them in the other direction, I think. So I want to talk about value a little bit. And so the late 18th century economists like Adam Smith and even like Ben Franklin and people like that would talk about value and a labor theory of value. And then Karl Marx in the 19th century. Wrote his book Capital and, talked about labor theory of value as well. And then, after that, I think, and I'm not an economist, but there was lots of talk about, laissez-faire and, different supply and demand, and less about actually what value is and where it comes from. And you address this right at the front end of your book. So could you talk a little bit about what value is and how that relates to working people in the United States and union members?
Yeah, I mean, the first chapter of the book is, talks about, sort of shop floor economics or class struggle economics. And the reason I start there is because that's really the fundamental point of class struggle unionism. And, we in the book, I talk about different theories of unionism. One is business unionism, which is a, conservative form of unionism, and how that differs from class struggle unionism. And what it turns out is that the difference between the two is how do you look at the workplace transaction. So when you think about it, once you become a certain age, it could be a teenager or beyond, you have to go out and get a job. And when you go out and get that job, if you're not working for one employer, you're working for the other. And I think the sort of more conservative business unionists typically look at it that, hey, you go and get a job. The union's role is to just, help you negotiate what their slogan would be, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. You put in your hours, you get whatever your rate is of pay, and your work rules are how you work under it. But at the end of the day, the employer owns the product that comes out of there, and all of the whatever you've created, and you have no rights to your workplace anymore. In contrast to that, there was a completely different view of the workplace, which is part of the central point of class struggle unionism. And instead of saying a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, the slogan of the class struggle unionist is labor creates all wealth. And it's really based on this idea that when you go to work, it doesn't matter whether you're a barista or an auto worker or a nurse or whatever, truck driver. What you share in common with the other workers is when you go to work, your labor takes whatever inputs are there from your employer and transforms them and makes them more valuable. And so we really talk about you creating value, and that your labor creates value. But at the end of the work shift, you're only paid for a fraction of the value that you create. So, and through these transactions, which happen in, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of workplaces around the United States and indeed around the world, that is why and how we get billionaires in society. And this great sort of differences in wealth is because the value that's created by workers flows upwards to a small handful of people. So like 3 billionaires own more than wealth than half of the population of the United States. So when we talk about, I think traditionally, the economists talked about it, I think a little bit more theoretical about the labor theory of value and use value in a lot of different terms. I think it's actually a pretty simple and intuitive concept, but that's like the key concept. And once you grasp that concept, or once you kind of accept that, then everything else in the book and class struggle unionism kind of flows from that basic difference.
So let me see if I got this right. So if me and all my coworkers at whatever factory ABC or whatever, a coffee shop or whatever it is, we produce maybe a certain amount, maybe $100,000 in profits over a period of a time, and but they pay us something less than that, like $80,000 or $50,000, and the rest of the money is what that's the surplus you're talking about. And so, but all of the increase of value comes from our labor. The ones even though we don't make we increase it by 100,000, but we get less than that, and that's the problem. Does that sum it up?
Yeah, that's true. And I think the mainstream economists, when they talk about it, and the employers will say that that they're actually the ones who take the risk, and they're the ones who create value because they're investing in creating jobs. It's actually quite interesting because in the presidential emergency board for the railroad workers that just got issued, which is a whole other story in relation to their struggle of the railroad workers for a fair contract, the employers explicitly argue that labor does not create any wealth. And they actually use that in their briefs to say that. So the idea of the employers is that they're the ones who actually take the risk. They're the ones who do it then, and they call it, and they would say, well, we're just taking our profit. But I think traditionally the employers have called it profit. The class struggle unionists have called it theft. I think our point of view is that, they say that they're supplying all the inputs to the, production process. So let's say if you're working in an auto factory, they're supplying the steel and all the rubber for the wheels and all of that. But when you think about it, they didn't create them. Those are created by other groups of workers who are similarly exploited. So all of the, sort of buildings that they say they're using to run the factory, well, who built those? Those were built by workers, and the employers end up controlling them and then using those things of value that were built to produce even more value, which they then pocket. So it's kind of this never-ending cycle where the richer you are, the richer you're going to get, and that's one of the fundamental questions we face as trade unionists. Because if we're just like the business unionists, focusing on a very narrow role that we have, which is just to negotiate with our individual employers over how much we're getting paid for one work shift, it leaves the door open for these employers to pocket all the monies and move our plants without any regard for our futures, and to open up a new plant, runaway shops and all of that, because in their view, it's completely legitimate. But in our view, and I think the traditional trade union movement, they viewed it that the value of the workers had really created those plants. So that's why in the 1930s, auto workers could do sit-down strikes, because they believed that they had a greater ownership stake in their employer and the place of employment than absentee landlords who may have never even set foot in the plant.
So you're saying that, so we're going to talk about, and you do in the book, about the difference between business unionism and class struggle unionism. And the business unionists in this case are historically the ones that have accepted a lot of this view, traditional view. But you're saying there was times in the past and sometimes even now where people take a different view, accept your view of value, and that leads them to a class struggle unionism. Could you give us a little bit of an introduction of what class struggle union is and how that looks differently? Yeah.
So if you look back for the first, 100, 150 years of trade unionism in the United States, the two basic trends within the union movement were business unionism. And business unionism, like I said, they view themselves with a pretty narrow viewpoint. They view themselves as representing, workers in one particular plant or maybe a craft within an industry. But their job is just to represent those workers against those employers. They usually think of it in terms of bad employers who won't reach deals. And they don't really view their struggle as part of a bigger struggle between workers as the creators of value in society and the owners, or I talk about it in the book, it's the billionaire class, or people historically called them capitalists because they're the ones who control the capital, which is income producing wealth. So in contrast, we got a long history of class struggle unionism. If you go back, some of the brightest battles in U.S. labor history were led by class struggle unionists. We have the industrial workers of the world in the early 1900s who, when the American Federation of Labor had a racist and exclusionary form of unionism, which just represented a handful of workers, you have unionists saying we need to organize all workers. In the 1920s, you got a rich history of the unions, close to the Communist Party in the 1920s, the Trade Union Unity League and Educational League, where, they engaged in some very bitter strikes down south and throughout the country, trying to, fight at a time when a lot of the labor movement was just lying down and not really fighting. you fast forward into the 1930s, the great battles of the 30s, very, very much animated by these ideas of class struggle unionism and led by people who shared this philosophy. And, I think more recently, we can look at the 1970s, which thousands of sort of radicalized students and anti-war and civil rights activists went into the labor movement with a different vision about what the labor movement was and could be. And, through their struggles helped contribute to a great wave of wildcat strikes and a sort of fight back against the anti-union offensive, which was starting to build in the 1970s and which, as we know, really picked up steam in the 80s.
So, correct me if I'm wrong here. So the business unionists are saying, we want to get a bigger piece of the pie, or, we want to stop the pie from shrinking, or whatever it is. We want to get as much as we can for our people. That would be their argument, I think. And the class struggle unionists say we should have the whole pie because we create all the value, all the wealth. Is that accurate, or?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. So an example of like the conservative business unions would be, let's say, some of the building trades, who, I remember a while back in Chicago where there was a fight over building Walmarts. And as long as they got the contract to build the Walmarts, they didn't really care what happened after that. So they would get the construction jobs to build it, or they get construction jobs to build the pipelines, but they don't really care about the social impact, but they also don't care about other workers. And that's been a traditional divide. In contrast, let's just drill down a little bit. So class struggle unionists have a view of the workplace transaction as sort of inherently unfair, and that it's that what really happens at work is you're separating workers from the wealth they're creating, and that's flowing upwards to this class of people. But because of that viewpoint, and because they view that as happening to all workers, both in the United States and around the globe, and it doesn't matter whether you're a black worker or a white worker or what industry you're working on, you're contributing to the sort of creation of the billionaires. You're being exploited. Because of that, they viewed it not just as a fight with individual employers, but as a fight between classes of people. Because you can talk about people who are working class, who have to work for a living, and you can talk about a different class of people, which is a relative small amount of the population, who can live off the labor of other people. So the quickest way to get rich is not to work hard yourself, but to get other people to work hard for you. So it's kind of based on this. I think in my book, I quote someone who talks about it, that to the extent that there's a surplus in society, that more is produced that's being consumed right away from the workers, there's an inevitable battle about who gets to control that surplus. And workers and class struggle unionists say that the workers should control it because workers created the wealth. The billionaires said that they should get it because that's the natural and divine order of the universe.
So one thing it strikes me, if you're a class struggle unionist, you just said it. You need to have a class outlook. So it seems that solidarity becomes very important to class struggle unionists. Is that true? And could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think traditionally class struggle unionists, saw themselves as all of us engaged in a battle with the employer class. So so I think class struggle unionists traditionally would look to support other workers in struggle, to join up with them. But it also led to a very sort of a deep, anti-racism and anti-sexism because of the viewpoint that we're fighting as an entire class, putting, particular importance of bringing all workers together. So if you go back in history and read the accounts of, how the class struggle unionists who played a key role, a lot of them were folks in or around the Communist Party in the 1930s. How did they build, organized steel and so forth? And it's very much how were they able to make these great inroads down south in the 1930s, forming an interracial unionism. And it's because they had a long history of prioritizing the fight against lynching and other forms of oppression against African Americans. So I think the class struggle unionists traditionally saw that as going hand in hand. and part of their struggle against the billionaire class, and not something that was, sort of separate from their unionism.
So could you give a current day example of a class struggle unionism, or someplace you think it's working, the way that you outline in your book? Or I'm sure it's, strengths and weaknesses within a union. It goes up and down or whatever. It's uneven. But who would you point to?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, clearly we got like a lot of different forms of unionism. I think that, of the national unions, I think the United Electrical Workers is probably the best example of a union that's consistently held a class struggle union outlook for decades. And, they used to be one of the, I won't go into their history that long. I know you had Carl Rosen.
We had Carl Rosen. Our listeners who missed that episode, go back and listen to it, and you'll get the story of the UE from Carl Rosen. Yeah. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but anyway, so, they were kind of red baited out of the 1950s. They used to have 500,000 members, one of the biggest unions in the country. But they're still around, and they believe in, sort of the, when we talk about class struggle unionism, we talk about like, what are the key features of class struggle unionism? Obviously class struggle unionists fight for the entire working class, but I think that there's a lot of distinguishing features between class struggle unions and the other ones. And one of those is, this concept of them and us. It's this idea that, that because of how we view the workplace transaction, we view that there's an inevitable struggle between the workers and the owners. So, I think the business unionists go around looking to put out fires and to dampen things down, whereas class struggle unionists are, more than willing to sort of engage in the fight and kind of build fights wherever they can. So it's a kind of them and us unionism that, our philosophy is that on every issue, our interests are diametrically opposed from those of the employers. So I think UE has long talked about that in form of union called them and us unionism. But there's others out there. I mean, I think there's a lot of folks around labor notes, traditionally who, the founders or so forth who, supported rank and file caucuses and anti-concessions. A lot of us, you and I, way back in the 80s and 90s, we're part of the anti-concessions movement, which is very much tied into, this class struggle unionism. I think the other, just briefly mention them, some of the other features are class struggle unionists, look towards fights on the shop floor. So the business unionists are really saying, well, we're just selling your labor and doing that transaction. And once you do it, we may have some work rules, but the employer really kind of, controls you for those 8 hours or however many hours you're working. But I think the class struggle unionists, and this is going back to sort of classic economic theory, understood, and I know it as a bargainer, and I'm sure you do too, that, I think the employers understand that, yeah, they can, if they have you for 8 hours, they can take a certain amount of the value you produce. But what if they can get you to work 12 hours? Or what if they can get you to work twice as hard during those 8 hours, but pay you the same? Then the amount of value that they're going to be able to take from your labor increases. So that's why we see so many fights over the length of the workday, why we see fights about productivity and what happens on the shop floor. Because I think employers understand, and I know this from bargaining, that you can fight over whether you're getting 4% or 3% or whatever the number raise is, but if they're able to like really take away key work rules and make you work harder, then they're pocketing way more money. So I think that's another big difference.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I've had over the years in the labor movement, I've had people occasionally come up to me and say, Richard, we need to get rid of this management rights clause. It's no good. And it's exactly, for those of you that are union members, you may know you have a management rights clause. I'll guarantee it in your contract. And it's what Joe was just talking about. It says that management has this kind of control. And so this push and pull on the shop floor becomes very important. Let me go back. I mean, you're correct, and I'm a student of labor history as well. And these fights between the class struggle unionists and the business unionists in debates, been going on for more than a century. But in your book, you introduce a new group. You call them the labor liberals, and they play a role that's concealed or new starting, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s, somewhere in there. I'll let you talk about it. But could you say who they are and what function they've played within the labor movement?
Yeah. So in the last several decades, a lot of the sort of leading ideas in the labor movement in terms of theory have come from a group that I call labor liberals. And in the 1980s, the unions, you had these bureaucratic business unions. You had, a relatively weak, but still important class struggle trend. And, unions were under attack by employers. And there developed a sort of grouping within the labor movement. And a lot of those were kind of the ex-student radicals who had gone into the labor movement, but 10, 15 years later, they might have gone back to graduate school and they were labor education professionals, or they might have been mid-level staffers or so forth, who rose in the ranks of the labor movement. And they started propagating an idea that, was against the sort of conservative business unionism, but it really wasn't class struggle unionism either. So it was kind of a third way. And I think it's probably best to, give some examples. I think in the 1990s, they were really focused on the organizing approach. That unions needed to be organizing, which we do, but it was a very staff-driven model, and one in which, not coincidentally, they were kind of leading as the, sort of expert organizers in the organizing departments. Kind of moving forward from there, I think it can be best typified in the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, at the international level. Certainly, I think there's a mix at the local levels, but it was this idea that they had a different form of unionism, and what they started to do was veer further and further away from the workplace. So you get to a situation where they're doing the fight for 15 and the fast food worker organizing, which on the one hand, it's important work and it's good, but it has a lot more in common with, sort of legislative activities of nonprofits than real sort of worker-led unionism. So they would do these strikes where they would use the language of the strikes and talk about strikes and send out, press releases on the strike, but they'd have very, very little participation, from the actual workers. So it would be like, a couple fired workers and a bunch of staffers and community support members, rather than, sort of traditional trade unionism. So I talk about it and I go through the book and I kind of explain, like, how do they differ from business unionism and class struggle unionism? And you can kind of go through, each of the points. And I think the problem with it is that it developed this form of unionism that, on the one hand, it helped us out in the labor movement because you were around back then. The labor movement, AFL-CIO back in the 1980s, was absolutely horrid.
No, it's true. It's true. I was there, and it was
horrible positions on immigration, on race, on pretty much down the line. If you did strike support work, they'd look at you with suspicion. It was like a subversive activity to support other workers. I remember going to the Central Labor Council and it's like, why are you working with them? Is that going to be another P9 or another internal battle?
What was P9?
It was one of the very important fightbacks of the 1980s, where a local of meatpacking workers down in Austin, Minnesota, chose to fight back against what it would turn out to be the sort of decimation of wage standards in the industry. And they were fighting to keep wages back then at like $11 an hour or so, if I recall. And I think that's right. But they were up against the International Union, which was promoting an orderly retreat and who was really not willing to fight. So it became a very, a cause that all of the class struggle unionists, this was some of my first labor rallies I went to, took up the cause of P9 in their fight. And in the course of their fight, they really they really started to, contend with the court system and how did they break free. We had some pretty militant picket lines down at the plant there. National Guard gets called in. Eventually, the international steps in. They really don't want this fight. They trustee the local. The local tries to extend the picket lines into other meatpacking plants, which is what should have been done and what historically would have been done. So it was a really kind of, and the business unionists really cracked down on anyone in the labor movement who supported them after a certain point.
So they're a good example of class struggle unionism then.
Yeah. I mean, I think they started out kind of militant business unionists, probably, but through the course of struggle, I think it became clear, and then they were supported with the class struggle trend throughout. So.
Okay. So then you were starting to counterpose the labor liberals to P9 or to class struggle unionists, and you said in your book you go through the whole thing. Why don't you do a little bit of that now and say how we're different than what they were, and how some of what they did was good, but some of it was confusing possibly.
Yeah. So first point, let's just go through the points. We got them and us unionism. So the business unionists don't really, they're always looking for accommodations. They may get in some fights with employers if they're bad employers, so they're willing to do open-ended strikes. But at the end of the day, they're trying to tamp things down. Class struggle unionists are out there trying to build and promote struggle wherever they can. Not that we don't get deals, but we're also looking to build the fight. The labor liberals is a little mixed because they talk about taking on industries, but when you look at their tactics, they're all very controlled. It's all the one-day strikes and the publicity strikes and the corporate campaigns and so forth. It's all sort of forms of struggle that don't lead to sort of sharp class-on-class struggle. I think we've also seen some of the downfalls of it in the 1990s. Andy Stern, who was the head of the Service Employees International Union, and talked a good game. But over time it became apparent that, he would use a little militancy to try and get the workers organized, but then he was very much into collaboration with employers. And now he's out shilling for the corporations, on these various boards and working with finance capital groups. So I think it's fundamentally different. So the other, sort of thing about the shop floor struggle, we already talked about the differences, with the class struggle unionists, how that's an important feature. I think with a lot of these initiatives that come out of the labor liberals, you can see it's even further removed from the workplace than the business unionists. So you got these worker centers, which do some good work, but they're not necessarily even rooted in particular workplaces and fighting, in the workplaces, and I'm not going to lump them all in one category, but like as a general rule. You got the Fight for 15 and all those initiatives, which really weren't, which are using the language of the labor movement, but not really traditional unionism based in the workplace. Another feature I didn't talk about was class struggle unionists believe that the working class must emancipate itself. So there's some big words, but it's basically to say that really believe in sort of union democracy and rank and file struggle and rank and file control of the process. And we're not there just to, be staffers and fix things for workers, but it's part of the worker struggle that the only way we're going to change society is by workers being involved in their own fights and leading them. And, I think the business unionists, view this bureaucratic role and staffers and experts, kind of know things. But also the labor liberals. I mean, you don't hear them talking about union democracy and those types of issues that have traditionally been key for the class struggle unionists. So you have a situation where the Service Employees International Union's taken, SEIU's taken these real progressive positions on all these social issues, but then at the same time, they're building these locals that are, a couple 100,000 members stretching up and down the coast. And there's no way that groups of workers can credibly control their workplace. So as opposed to like the UE, which would be, one plant or one, workplace, one local. So you at least have some ability to control it. So I think it's just down the whole host of items.
Well, let me go back on some of this. So, to take some of what SEIU did, and was sharply debated at the time. There was a split in the AFL-CIO led by SEIU, but what they said at the time was we need to put more resources into organizing the unorganized. That we'd lost density in our power as unions because we'd become so small that we needed to put more resources into unionizing, and by consolidating, they were, just like a business, I suppose. They were getting rid of redundancies and were able to, put the resources into organizing the unorganized. And I think, all union people would say, yeah, we need to organize even now. Lots more people. We're, 6 or 7% of the private sector right now. And so, how would you answer that?
One, it didn't work. And it didn't work for a reason. So, and I talk about this a lot more in my first book, which is Reviving the Strike, where I sort of critique that whole approach. And I wrote that book it was published in 2011. But I think what I noted was that, SEIU spent $1 billion just by themselves as one union between like 1995 and 2004. Yet, despite all of that expenditures, and they hired tons of organizers out of college and so forth, and they pushed the whole labor movement to do the same thing, but they were unable to budge density in their core jurisdiction, healthcare. And if you look at the numbers, it basically was static during that period. The growth that they got was mainly through sort of affiliations of these independent unions and so forth, or merger agreements. And the reason it didn't work is that it didn't really focus on the fundamental problem and the cause of labor's decline, which wasn't necessarily organizing or inability to organize, although we as class struggle unionists obviously support organizing, right? We don't think it's not okay that we have 6 out of 100 private sector workers in unions. But the problem is that we lack, an effective strike and bargaining power and an ability to really take on capital. And what we've shown throughout history is that when unions focus on regaining militancy and the ability to, whether it takes violating labor law or whatever it takes, that's when we make the sort of big qualitative breakthroughs that are going to bring people into our labor movement. So I think they were basically fundamentally focused on the wrong strategy. And I would say not just back then, but for the last 20, 25 years, they have sort of promoted one idea after another. And all of them have like these kernels or even more than a kernel of truth. Of course, we need to organize the unorganized. Of course, we need to bargain for the common good. Of course, we need to, meaning we have to have broad demands and fight for the entire class. Those are all core things we believe in. Of course, there should be, ties with community groups. But none of them can revive the labor movement, and that's why we're stuck in the problem we are. And the basic problem we have is one between, do we believe in class conflict or class collaboration? And until we sort of refound the labor movement on class struggle principles, we're not going to revive the labor movement. So they can hire all the organizers they want, and it's not going to work.
Some of what I think what you're calling labor liberals have pushed also is for more political solutions through the electoral system, particularly, like the Fight for 15 was a lot of that in different city councils passing it in states and trying to increase the floor of wages. And you just alluded to the fact that labor laws are very restrictive to workers right now. And there's the 1% that has been successful at getting the laws that they want. What's your view of electoral politics? Shouldn't we be trying to elect people? I mean, for a democracy, shouldn't we be able to elect people to do the things that we want them to do and to change the laws to get a $15 minimum wage or whatever it is?
Yeah. So, one, I think it's correct that the labor liberals, essentially have a legislative, sort of agenda. And they use the language, and in many cases they've kind of captured or, are in charge of some unions or central labor councils, but they're not really necessarily looking to organize the workers, but really to use strikes and the discussion of strikes and these fake publicity strikes in order to get legislation passed. Now, it's not that that's a bad thing, getting legislation passed, but it's not the same as traditional trade unionism, and it's not a substitute for unionism. In terms of the bigger question, which is, probably ties into another set of beliefs of class struggle unionists, is, traditionally the class struggle unionists would say the bosses have two parties. It's time for the workers to have one. That was Tony Mazzocchi, the legendary and great leader of the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, father of OSHA, and, a lot of things. But he
Labor
also,
Party, yes.
in the 1990s, as you know, Rich, he played a key role in forming Labor Party advocates, which was kind of a pre-Labor Party formation. So I think, one of the problems that we see with the labor movement, and this is both the labor liberals and the business unionists, is the close sort of ties and identification with the Democratic Party. And the problem with that is that the Democratic Party, even though it gets some union funding and so forth, is a party that overall is sort of, in the thralls of the billionaire class. And it is not truly an independent party if you look at the funding and so forth and the sort of set of ideas that, sway it, particularly at the national level. So part of the problem with that is it allows for the entry into the labor movement. It's not just wasted resources supporting people who are going to stab us in the back, but it's also that, the close ties between the top Democrats and the top labor officials. It gets us kind of thinking like them, which is really not thinking like, the workers that are supposed to be represented, but more like the managers and funders of the Democratic Party.
Well, I mean, it seems to me, though, the Democrats have not been effective as an offensive weapon, at least not in my lifetime, and I'm old. But I look at like Wisconsin, where they had Act 10, and they were, other places where they've tried to just outlaw unions or as much as they can, and where the Republican Party has succeeded in taking both houses and the governorship. Where they become right to work and, whatever the public sector is outlawed. And the Democrats, as a defensive weapon, potentially could have held on to that or vetoed, or I don't know what the deal is. But how would you answer something like that?
Well, I mean, I think if you wind back the clock to 2010 or 2011 and look at a lot of the statements out there, I think there were a lot of statements turning on public employee unions from the Democratic Party officials in these states. And, traditionally, my second book was Strike Back, which talks about the public employee strikes of the 1960s and 70s. And that was a militant strike wave that was, predominantly conducted against the Democratic Party and Democratic Party officials. And we had to, engage in a whole series of illegal strikes to be able to gain our unions. I think if you look at the experience here in Chicago, for example, we talk about the teachers' union strikes. We talk about the red state strikes, which were down in, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and so forth. But we also had the blue state strikes, where starting with the Chicago teachers, you have this, 10-year battle with the Democratic administration. Who's supporting the underfunding of schools and so forth. So I think it's a little bit different, the battles that you have with the Democrats and the Republicans. But I think, we end up having our battles with them both. And I think on the bigger picture of sort of labor law and labor reform, I think that the Democrats are willing to, support us within a narrow sort of band. But once we get beyond that, and workers start engaging in the type of militancy that we would need, to revive the labor movement, we got the case going on with the mine workers, where the Biden NLRB has the region there has come up with the novel idea that part of the injunction and damages against the union is lost production of the employer during the strike, which is unheard of. So they're basically those. I think Cecil Roberts said, the mine worker said, the point of a strike is to cause them to lose production. But now you're going to go and, because of some isolated picket line conduct, I won't say misconduct, I'll say conduct. Now you're going to come after the union. So I think we also saw that with I won't go on forever, but you saw that with the Obama NLRB coming down hard on militancy and the ILWU, the longshore workers in the West Coast, and they're still fighting the sort of $18 million in fines that they got.
So in your book, if I'm right, you suggest we just need to throw down here, and if the laws, we can't let them get in the way of our victory, and that and even you even suggest we may need to break some laws. How do you see that? I mean, that seems like a high risk thing to me.
Well, I mean, I think it's a key question facing the labor movement, but one that's rarely discussed. Over the years, what the employers have been able to do with their allies in Congress and the courts is institute what I call a system of labor control, where all of the effective traditional tactics of labor have been outlawed. So now all that's allowed is, you can form your union, maybe if you can get through the repression by the employers. But then when you bargain, you have the so-called right to strike, but employers can permanently replace you. And, we had a little period in the last couple of years where the labor market was pretty constricted, so workers had the confidence in production to be striking, but that's a temporary feature. And what we found in the 80s and beyond is employers could use all of the tools that they have and bust unions and bust strikes. So if we're going to revive we can't have a class struggle union movement if we don't have class struggle tactics. So I got a whole chapter on that, and I think the key point here is, in order to be able on a widespread scale to engage in these sort of tactics, militancy, plant occupations, and so forth, we need a set of ideas, a class struggle set of ideas that are going to validate those actions. And I think historically in the 1930s, that's what people had. They believed in their right to do it. And likewise in the 1960s, teachers believed in their right to strike, and they were willing to defy injunctions and go out on strike.
So in your union, the Association of Flight Attendants, your president, Sarah Nelson, has been an outspoken critic of the AFL-CIO. And in fact, you are too, right here on Fight Back Radio today in some ways, but in some of those tactics. But could you talk a little bit about there was talk of her running for president of the AFL-CIO at one time, and there was of trying to push these things. Do you think that's something we should be trying to do, is to try to run people for head of the AFL-CIO and for offices like that, and with these ideas?
I think it's a very difficult situation because AFL-CIO is, you go to the convention and it's not like it's elected by, what all the delegates think they're. The votes at the international convention are tightly controlled by the international union presidents who, by and large look very different than the membership that they represent. A lot of them are, older white males, and I don't think in general are that open to the type of change that we need in the labor movement. So I think the question of how do we sort of build a class struggle trend in the labor movement, I do think it is and I think I have discussion about this. I think it is a two-pronged strategy. Both, I think we need to, and we don't do enough of putting demands on our national union leaders. I think in the last couple of decades, basically, I don't think anyone really looks to the AFL-CIO national leadership for leadership. None of the activists that I know in the labor movement are looking there. 20 years ago, I think people were trying to fight and push the AFL-CIO to take different positions. There was a big fight with Change to Win, and even before that in the 1990s. But nowadays, they're not really part of the debate. I think people are going out and organizing on their own. We've got the Starbucks workers organizing, the Amazon workers organized. And where's the AFL-CIO to be found in that? They're not even in the discussion, you know? Mm-hmm. So in part, people are doing that because, they're not really helpful. But on the other hand, I think class struggle unionists traditionally have had an idea that their goal wasn't just to go out and do it themselves and organize themselves, that their goal was to transform the entire labor movement and put it on a class struggle basis. And that was by putting forward demands, by contending, within unions and so forth. That's why historically the sort of idea of these union democracy networks were so important. So I don't think in the long run we can just ignore the labor federations, but I think transforming them is it's a big task, and it probably has to start off with reforming smaller, building a bigger trend within the labor movement.
So let me ask you, if I'm a union member at some place, and whether it be labor liberals or business unionists, but running my union, but I'm not in the UE, let's say, and I'm not, where do I start? How do I do this? How do I get class struggle unionism if we don't have it here? How do we get from here to where we need to be?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a general, approach to labor work. So I think, a lot of it is based on building struggle and believing in the rank and file and believing in your coworkers. So I think the way that we traditionally have transformed unions is, some people say you just go out and run and try and take over your local and do that. But I think the more successful sort of strategies, I think if you look at the Chicago Teachers Union, for example, the core, the caucus within the union, they, very much started engaging in struggles over the closing of schools and so forth, and struggles with the employer. So I think most of the class struggle unionists kind of do those two together. I think in my book I quote, I think it's quoting Farrell Dobbs from the 1930s Minneapolis truckers strike, but talking about you start to fight with the employer, and the bureaucrats will get caught in the crossfire. So it's not like you're putting the main sort of fire against them. But I think the more we build struggle, that's how we transform our unions, and then you end up putting demands on the union leadership to be with you or fight, or else you're going to have to move past them. And I think that's historically what I've seen.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. Is there anything you'd like to add? Any message you'd like to tell the Fight Back Radio listeners?
No, I hope you folks will check out Class Struggle Unionism. I think there's a lot of concepts in there that we can have further discussion on. A lot of folks are, which is interesting, have been doing studies of the book with their coworkers, where they go through the chapters and kind of have discussions about how it applies to their work. If you want to do that, you can get discounted copies through Haymarket, and we can hook you up there.
Okay, so we'll put it in the show notes, but the book is Class Struggle Unionism by Haymarket Books. And you've had two earlier books, which I would also recommend, Strike Back and Reviving the Strike. So you look for those wherever books are sold, I guess. You have a Facebook page, Reviving the Strike, as well, that people can find you there. And so thank you so much. It's been a rich discussion, and hopefully it's provoked some of our listeners to have some discussion with their coworkers as well. So thank you, Joe.
All right. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you, Joe Burns. As I just encourage people, go out and buy Joe's book, Class Struggle Unionism. I think it's one of the more important books written about the labor movement in recent times, and it'll spark some discussion if you're in the labor movement or not. I know some of my friends who have been around 50C3s have it sparked some discussion with them, as well as those in the labor movement. 50C3s, by the way, are the not-for-profit organizations. So go out and check it out, and check out some of Joe's earlier books too, Strike Back and Reviving the Strike, both excellent books. I want to also, before we go off the air, I want to make a correction. I made a mistake in our last episode with Richard Blake, and I should have known better. Richard at one point talked about the Taft-Hartley bill and said it passed in the 1947 or late 40s, and I corrected him and said, no, I think the early 50s, and I was wrong. And Richard Blake was correct, and I'm a little embarrassed because I consider myself a student of labor history, but I wanted to make that correction. But also, just to say, if you've held with us in the podcast this long, you should subscribe to this podcast if you are not right now, and you should like it. We want you to do that. We want you to tell a friend about it, to promote us on social media, all these things, write a review. This helps people find us. And, I think we have a good podcast here. We've had some really good guests, and I want people to hear them, and we want to, lift them up. We'll continue to do that. So I want to thank, once again, Joe Burns for being our guest this week. Finally, I also want to thank our Fight Back radio production team of Vince Olson, Shane Tremley, and Doug McClogan. For the entire Fight Back radio team, I'm Richard Berg, saying until next time, all power to the people.